So we're going to simplify some radicals that end up giving us imaginary answers. So let me start with something like square root of negative 16. So if I had the square root of negative 16, we've been practicing breaking up these radicals. And so this 16, I know 16 is a perfect square, and the question is how do I deal with that negative value? So here we go, we're going to do it. This square root of negative 16, I could think of negative 16 as 16 multiplied by negative 1. So if I think about it this way, this is going to be the square root of 16 multiplied by the square root of negative 1. And I know how to do this. Square root of 16 is 4. And then it's 4 times the square root of negative 1. And then the question becomes, what is this? Like, how do I deal with this? So square root of negative 1, it is a number. It's not a real number. It's what's called an imaginary number. So I'm going to give you a definition. The symbol I is the number that we use to symbolize the square root of negative 1. So square root of negative 1 and I, exactly the same thing. I is what we use for that. So if you just take a little leap of faith, believe that that is true, see it's even happy. This 4 times the square root of negative 1 would be the same as 4i. And mathematicians call that an imaginary number. They don't call it imaginary because it's fanciful or because it's part of a story. It is an actual number. It's just an unfortunate choice of words that we use for imaginary. Let me do another one similar to this. So if I had, for example, the square root of negative 25, I'm going to split that up. I'm going to think about it as the square root of 25 multiplied by negative 1. Square root of 25 I can do, that's a 5. Square root of negative 1, what is it? Well, it's I. 5i. And that 5i is, again, it's a number. It's just an imaginary number. All right, let me do one last example like this. So, for example, let's say I had square root of negative 75. So 75 isn't a perfect square, but let me split that up. 75, that's 25 times 3 times negative 1. And I can do these a piece at a time. Square root of 25, that's 5. Square root of negative 1, that's I. Square root of 3, well, I'm not going to be able to resolve that, so I'm going to leave it as square root of 3. So I can write it like this. Sometimes folks write it this way. Sometimes folks write it this way. They're both acceptable ways to write it. All right. I hope that's helpful.